How's it going, Eliminators? Today I'm going to be showing you how to clean a carb on a Toro CCR 2450. So let's get right into it. This is a 2-stroke single stage snowblower, and my customer said there was a slight fuel leak coming from the back end here. So I'm assuming that it's just a leaky needle valve on the carburetor. So I'm going to clean and rebuild the carburetor, and we're also going to have a look at this primer line and maybe even the recoil. Okay, so because this is a 2-stroke, you don't have to worry about oil in the bottom end. So the first thing I'm going to do is just flip this up on its end so that we can have a little better access at our access panel. Just come down to the bottom one here, use an 8mm socket. You can remove those 2 bolts there, and there may be a Phillips screw down on the bottom side. Once you get your bolts and screws removed, go ahead and take your choke lever and put it into the straight position, and you should be able to just slide this panel right off, exposing our carburetor and our fuel line to your fuel tank. So if we remember back to what my customer said, they said they had a fuel leak, and the bottom of the bowl here on the carburetor is wet. We can also see that mice have started to build a little nest. Leaving that in there will cause the engine to run hotter because it won't be able to radiate the heat, because all that mouse hair in there will actually act as an insulation. But moving back to the carburetor, take this little air dam here, and we're just gonna pop this off of our choke lever, and then you're gonna have 2 Phillips screws here, and you're gonna wanna use a number 3 Phillips. That's the big fat one, and we're going to use that to remove the carburetor. So because the snowblower is flipped up on its front end, the fuel tank won't be draining fuel into the carburetor. However, because I'm going to look at that primer bulb after, I'm going to use a fuel line clamp on my fuel line. So I have my screws loose, but before I remove it, I just want to add that you should take note which position certain parts are in. So for instance, this little air scoop here, it's aiming up so that the air is coming in from the top. And if at any point you're unsure of how things go together, just take a picture of it before you take it apart. So off comes our little air scoop here with a gasket as well. So I've gone ahead and disconnected our governor spring from our throttle there. Next up, I'm going to use a pair of pliers to remove our fuel line clamp, and we're going to unhook the fuel line. And after you get your fuel line disconnected, now would be a good time to come and remove your primer line as well. So having a closer look, we can see that our governor linkage comes down, up, and then out. So that governor linkage goes back into your engine to a governor arm underneath this cover here. So to make sure that we don't have to remove that, we're going to try not to move it on this end too much. So what we're going to do is simply lift the carburetor up a bit and rotate it slowly off of that governor linkage. So I'm going to hold the governor linkage as I rotate that carburetor off. Just make sure that you go slow, because this is a plastic throttle lever here and you don't want to break that. So again, I just lifted up and rotated this off of that governor linkage there. So I'm just going to leave everything just like that. But now would be a great time to go ahead and inspect your gasket here. Air leaking in here is no good, because it will cause a lean fuel mixture, which is not good for your machine. So again, we're just gonna have a look at this gasket, and it looks to be in okay condition. It's not ripped, it's not torn, and it looks like we can reuse that. So I might just go ahead and wipe that up a bit just to clean it up a little bit. And while we're here, it would be a great time to go ahead and take your number 3 Phillips and just make sure that those screws on your intake manifold are tight. And that will ensure that there isn't an air leak at your intake manifold, because sometimes they can loosen off just from engine vibration. Okay, so having a closer look at our carburetor, if you want to take your choke lever off here, it looks like it's just a Phillips screw on here. Now this seems a little bit loose, and there is a washer on there, so someone may have replaced that. Not sure if yours is going to be the same. However, this carburetor number is a 801054, so that's your part number for this carb if you need any parts. But what we're interested in are the 4 Phillips screws on the bottom of this carburetor. So I'm going to remove those screws, and we're going to take off that sediment bowl. So with the screws out, our sediment bowl is off. We can have a little closer inspection here. We can see that in the bottom portion of the bowl, there is quite a bit of gunk built up in there, and that's what it's supposed to do. So that little indentation down there is actually designed to trap all the gunk. And we can see that there's a little bit of dirt on our pickup tube as well. So that screen, you can simply just slide that off, and it will then expose your main jet. So what we're going to do is take a small standard or flat head screwdriver. We're going to remove that small jet in the center, and then we're going to take a larger screwdriver and remove that bigger piece. So that is a 2-piece main jet design. So using a small screwdriver, we were able to remove our our main jet, and then using a slightly larger screwdriver, we were able to remove our distribution tube. Now, you want to keep in mind that on most of these, they do have a little brass washer on the distribution tube, but now's a good time. Go ahead and check out all of these holes because you want to make sure that they're clean and free of debris. Looking up against the window, I can also see that the main jet looks fairly clean. Next up, it's a good time to have a little look at our bowl gasket here, and I can see that it's not ripped or torn, so this looks like it's in fairly good condition. So we should be able to reuse that. I do have replacement parts for these carburetors if I need them, because this carburetor is essentially a lawn boy carburetor. So they use the same lawn boy parts, the distribution tube, the main jet, the float, the sediment bowl gasket. All of these parts are interchangeable with a lot of lawn boy carburetors. So next up, we're gonna go ahead and push out our float pin, and we're gonna remove our float. Now, before I go ahead and remove the float, now is a great time to pressure test our needle valve. So I'm gonna be using a carburetor pressure tester here, and what this does is it puts air into your carburetor and it pressure tests the needle valve there. So what I'm going to do is hold my carburetor to the level position. Now this should be holding air, but it's not. It is leaking. So that is the cause of our leak. So once you get your float off, we can have a closer look, and we can see that this carburetor uses a rubber tipped needle valve. And what will happen is that tip will actually deform over time as it's being pressed into your fuel inlet there. So now's a good time to go ahead and remove our fuel inlet. However, before I go any further, I would like to note that on some carburetors, they do require a plastic washer that goes underneath of that inlet. And what that does is it slightly raises the inlet. So at this point, I would recommend running the number on your carburetor, and then if you can, pull up a diagram, and it will show you an exploded view of this carburetor, and you should be able to see if there is in fact a plastic washer that goes in between your fuel inlet and your carburetor. I got that off of Toro.com. The link will be in the description for part numbers for any parts you may need for this carburetor. That inlet does not require the plastic washer underneath of it. And like I said, I have a carb kit for this. So we have the brass fuel inlet, and we also have a brand new needle valve, and our part number is a Stens 525-303. And last but not least, on the side of your carburetor, you should have a brass jet, so you're going to want to remove that as well. On the bottom of that, you're going to see a small, tiny little hole, and I'm going to be using my oxyacetylene tip cleaner to just poke out those holes and make sure that's clean. Now, if you find that the hole is just too small, what I have here is just a little wooden dowel with a piece of metal wire in it, and that is normally small enough to get inside of those little idle jets, as they call them. So using a flathead screwdriver, I just went ahead and removed the needle inlet as well as the needle valve from our float. So now our carburetor is pretty much completely disassembled. I'm going to leave this choke lever on here because I don't really have to take it off. But now comes time for cleaning. So we have to understand that this little port here, that's where your primer line goes, and it forces air through, and that air going in there ends up putting fuel directly into your main. So you want to make sure that that's blown out and is free and clear of debris. Holding it up to my window, I can see that it is clear, although it looks like there may be a little bit of gunk in there. So for you guys at home that may not have an ultrasonic cleaner like I do, I'm going to show you how to clean this with a little bit of carb cleaner. So I have some Gumout small engine carb and choke cleaner. Now, because this is a pressurized bottle, you can take the tip, force it into the holes on your carburetor, and I'll show you which ones, and you're just going to be blasting all the gunk that may be in there out. So this is where your main jet goes. That ends up going into your port, which is at the center inside of your carburetor there. So you're going to want to make sure that's clean. You want to clean your fuel inlet as well. Make sure you blow that out from this side as well, because there could be some gunk in your fuel tank that ends up getting into this fuel inlet here if you don't run an inline fuel filter. We can see here there is an inline fuel filter on this one, but you may not have one, and we'll address the fuel line and fuel filter after. Now you want to go up to the front of your carburetor, and you're going to notice a little hole here, and you may also have a little hole there, and then just go around and clean the outside as well, so that when you're reassembling everything, you don't get a piece of gunk that falls off there and lands inside of your carburetor when you're putting it all back together. You also want to go ahead and spray all of these little holes. Make sure that your distribution tube, which we can see perfectly right there, that it looks like there is a piece of gunk in there. And I just used my oxyacetylene tip cleaner to push that little piece of gunk out of the distribution tube here. So looking at it again, we can see that it's a little bit cleaner now. But like I've shown you in previous videos, I'm going to be using my ultrasonic cleaner because this does a far better job than carburetor cleaner could ever do. So this has been run yesterday and it's been left to sit. So all of that stuff came out of a carburetor. all of that stuff in there. So I got my carburetor here, and I'm going to be running it for about 5 minutes in my ultrasonic cleaner here. I've also gone ahead and taken off my fuel line here, and I'm just going to replace the fuel line as well as the fuel filter. That just gives me a guarantee that once I put this back together, I won't have an issue of a fuel line cracking and leaking once I've already spent the time to do the repair. And for the cost of a fuel filter and a fuel line, I say it's well worth it to go ahead and do that so that you don't have any issues afterwards. Okay, so I got my carb and all my jets out of the ultrasonic cleaner. The bowl cleaned up nice too. Everything is now clean, and I've taken my air compressor to blow out all of the holes and any little nooks and crannies on this carburetor here. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the needle inlet in, and I can't stress enough the point that you're going to want to have a nice clean workspace when you're putting everything back together, as well as clean screwdrivers when you're putting all of your jets back in. Now would be a good time to go ahead and install your main as well as your little side jet here. Just make sure that you're not over tightening things because this is a plastic carburetor, so you could strip the threads easily. And I just took a little dab of 3-in-1 oil and I put it down inside of the inlet there. You can see it, it's slightly wet, and all that does is it makes the needle valve seal a little bit better when bench testing it. So you never really want to test a dry needle valve on a dry seat. So that just kind of simulates a little bit of fuel in there. So now with our float reinstalled, and you guys want to make sure that when you install this float, you level it as best you can. So that seems good to me, and we're going to pressure test it. I also put the main jet little screen back on as well. So with the new needle valve installed on our carburetor, I hooked up my pressure tester, and you can see that we are sealing right at 5 psi. We can see that it's not dropping down, which means that our needle valve is in fact sealing. So we know that the carburetor won't leak. We know that the fuel line won't leak because we got a new fuel line on there. So this snowblower should not leak fuel anymore. It should be good to go. So we're going to grab the bowl gasket here. We're going to put that on. We're going to get our bowl reinstalled. Once again, just make sure you don't over tighten anything because again, you don't want to strip anything. So this carburetor is ready to be reinstalled back on the machine. But before I do that, I've put a little piece of tape here because I'm going to clean up this mouse nest. So go ahead and take your governor linkage and reconnect it to your carburetor. We've now hooked up our governor linkage. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and slide our little piece here with the gasket on the inside and the gasket on the outside. I'm going to slide that up underneath, and then we're going to put the bolts through just to hold the carburetor into position. Okay, now it might be a little difficult for me to get this on video, but I would highly recommend that you push your screws through and double check that you have your gasket, the plate, the gasket, and then your carburetor all lined up so that you make sure that you don't miss a hole so that a little gasket is hanging sideways, because then you'll be sucking air, which you don't want to do. And once you have those carb screws tightened down, go ahead and reconnect your governor spring to your throttle. Now, once you have that governor spring reconnected like I have, just go ahead and pinch the little tab at the end there to make sure that it's not too open and that it won't slip off. Then you can go ahead and hook up your primer line. Now, I have to replace the primer bulb, so I'm not going to be hooking that up just yet, but I am going to hook up my new fuel line. New fuel lines hooked up, clamps were good, so I didn't have to replace them. So I'm pretty much ready now to flip this down and have an inspection of that little top cover to see about replacing the primer. So I removed 3 8mm bolts from this cover here, and that exposes this metal plate underneath. So with the snowblower flipped up again, it looks like there's 2 10mm bolts that hold that on as well. So with those 10mm bolts out, the plate is now loose, and we should be able to just flip it up enough to the point where I can unhook the old primer bulb, and then we can also have a look at the spark plug while we're here. So all you have to do is disconnect your primer hose, pinch those 2 tabs, and pull it straight up. And I should have one of these in my inventory, so I can go ahead and replace it. And what is usually the case, the black soft rubber, the bulb itself usually deteriorates over time. And it looks like I do in fact have a primer bulb replacement. The number is Stens 120-440, and that replaces a Toro or Lawn Boy 66-7460. Once again, I took just a little bit of 3-in-1 oil, put it onto that lip there that catches on the white plastic piece, and then I'll make it so it just slips on a little bit easier without tearing or damaging the black rubber bulb. And also a good point is just make sure that there's no gunk inside of that primer bulb. Now, these can be a pain in the butt to install because the rubber is smaller than the diameter of the white plastic piece. So I actually have a little tool, a little tip here for you guys. I use a paint can opener. It's got a nice wide edge on it with the slightest little hook on it, and you're just going to go in there and pry it over. Now when you replace this, you want to make sure you just give it a little spin, make sure that it's on. But the most important thing is you want to make sure that it actually works and holds a little bit of pressure. So put your finger over that tiny little hole on the bulb and give it a press. Make sure that it doesn't depress too much, and then when you let go, you should hear a little bit of air come out. Just like that. Okay, so now that I have my primer bulb hooked up, I connected the line up there as well as down on the carburetor. So now I'm just going to probably pull the spark plug, replace it if necessary, and then I can start reassembling those panels. And using a 3/4 socket, I was able to get the plug out. These are garbage plugs though. It's an Autolite 2976. I'm going to go ahead and replace it with a Champion RCJ8Y plug gapped at 30 thousandths of an inch. Okay, so I've got my 10 mil bolts back in the back, my 8 mil bolts back into the front. Now the pull start cord for the most part looks fairly good all the way down, except right near the handle here I can see that it's starting to fray. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it right about here, and I'm going to retie that handle down farther so that it doesn't snap on my customer. So I've just gone ahead and tied a very loose knot there on the handle, and when you cut this you want to end up burning that with a lighter so that there's no frayed ends. So just using a little screwdriver I was able to pop out the metal piece, and then like I said, I'll burn the end on the machine, pull it through, I'll tie a double knot, I'll pull the double knot back into this metal piece, and we'll be good to go. Just give it a couple pulls, make sure you're happy with how firm you can pull that. So I'm going to go ahead, pop that back in, and then we're done. And before I go and put the plastic cover on the back, I popped the air dam back over the choke. Okay, I got my back plastic shroud back on, and just a little note here, it does say fuel mix 50:1 ratio to cycle. So 50:1 is what I normally mix on pretty much all of my machines because it just burns a lot smoother, a lot cleaner. You don't have to worry about your spark plug fouling up as much, and you won't have to clean your carb as much because a lot of times the old Toros and especially the Lawn Boys, they said mix your oil at 32:1, which is a super rich mixture. Okay, I got 1 liter of 50:1 fuel mixed up, so I'm going to fire this thing up. This thing runs great. She fired right up first pull. The primer works now that we got the primer bulb replaced, and I made sure that the auger engaged as well. Okay, so I pulled the panel off of the machine because something weird happened. Remember I was saying that this didn't really seem like it was factory because, you know, there's a washer on that screw and it was a little loose. So I let this thing run for about a minute, and the choke lever ended up vibrating over to the right, choked the machine out, and it died on me. I'm gonna try to put a little piece of rubber hose on that little plastic post, and maybe that'll just create a little bit more tension on that choke. So I'm just going to try to see if I can get this to the point where it's a little firmer, and I can actually see what the problem is. Over time it's slightly worn that post down ever so slightly, so there's just not as much tension on it. Okay, so my plan worked out beautifully. You can see I got a little bit of, it's like a chainsaw fuel line, and it gives this choke lever here a little bit more tension. Now I hope that doesn't pop off. I might end up cutting that a bit shorter, but it works out pretty good. There's some decent amount of tension, and I don't think it'll rotate over on its own. Okay, so modification number 2, I've cut the fuel line a little shorter, and I've taken a little tiny dab of epoxy, and I've just put it in there just to hold it in place. So I'm gonna let that set up, and then I'm just gonna test it out once that's dry. Because we have to remember that on a snowblower carburetor, you have a little spring, and every time you push it, you guys can see it pushes out, and then it pops back in again. There's always constant tension on it because it's a tiny little spring here. So if they would have used something like that, it probably would have been a little bit better, but you have to remember that the solution to some of the trickiest problems will normally come in the simplest of forms. And at the end of the day, you got to work with what you got. So that's it for today's video. This thing ended up running nice. The auger works. Everything's good to go. And we ended up getting that little choke lever vibration issue fixed up as well. So if you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click over here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week. So be sure to stop on by next week. Check the channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.